We now come to lecture 8 in our series of lectures on cultural studies. Well, the topic for today's lecture is Marxism. We look at Marxism as a theory that could explain our cultural practices, our cultural arrangements. You will recall that in the last lecture, we were introduced very briefly, of course, to theory, and we learned that theory may be defined as an intellectual activity which enables us to interpret, generalize and critique things. Okay? The first theory that we took up was structuralism, which we understood as a science of humankind. And we learned that the basic approach in structuralism is to discover or uncover certain basic structures, okay, be it in language or in culture. We also understood that structuralism sees things in a whole system of relations. No entity, no word, no practice, no idea, no object or event is seen in isolation within structuralism. Meaning for anything is supposed in structuralism to emanate from a system of relations. We talked about semiology, the science of signs, and we looked at the work of Ferdinand de Saussure. We learned that a word is explained as a sign, or it is considered a sign, and an important aspect of Saussurean structuralism is that the sign is may be divided into the signifier or the sound image and the signified or the concept. And this entire process is known as the process of signification. Okay? Meaning emanates owing to this process of signification. Culture, in this sense, following the linguistic model, is seen as a structured system of signifying practices. Rules and units are part of the system, and their combination gives rise to meaning. We also saw that binary opposites like nature, culture, like day and night, good and evil, old and young, are the basic, very basic structure in the school of structuralism. Okay, it's something very basic, and psychologists say that for a child, okay, the whole mechanism, so to speak, of binary opposites is his first way of categorizing, or her first way of categorizing the world, or his or her perceptions. Well, today we look at another cultural theory, and as you know, the two most important figures in Marxism are Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. They collaborated to write what is one of the most famous treatises, okay, the Communist Manifesto. There are many ways of doing cultural studies. Okay. Many ways, as I said, as many ways as there are teachers to teach cultural studies, and every teacher would find his or her own methodology or way of teaching the subject. I mentioned that our basic question in this entire course would be this, a very simple question. This is, why do we live the kind of lives that we live? All of us live certain kind. What is it to live a certain kind of life? A certain kind of life would have certain habits which come from certain beliefs and values that we hold to be either good or bad, or things that are desirable to be followed or not to be followed, right? And we do live a certain kind of life and not others. So our basic question throughout this course would be this: and we are trying to find out why we live lives in a certain kind of way. As if we believe in God, then why do we do so? If we do not believe in God, for instance, why do we do so? Okay? Well, here Marxism is a cultural theory which seeks to give a historical and materialist explanation for the kind of lives that we live. Okay? It is one way of explaining and telling us why we live, that is, which is our question here, why we live the kind of lives that we live. Now, what are the questions that are addressed by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels? For instance, one could be this: what gives rise to the clash of conflicting ideas and strivings? Why do people have different ideas? Why don't we have a commonality of ideas? Okay? Why, and ideas and strivings, why do we strive for different things? Okay? So, what gives rise to these clashes in between or among our ideas and strivings? This is one legitimate question addressed by Marxism. Second question, and I take this from the Great Soviet Encyclopedia: what is the sum total of these clashes in the mass of human societies? Third, what are the objective conditions of production of material life that form the basis of all of man's historical activity? That is, under what conditions, okay, is our material life produced? And these conditions are not subjective conditions, these are objective conditions. They are clear-cut, observable, okay, conditions under which we work. For instance, all of us do labor, no matter at what stage in the whole hierarchy of any institution or system. The point is, all of us labor, all of us do work. So, by doing our work, we produce, okay, we produce or reproduce our material life. Okay? The work that we do enables us to live a certain kind of life at any certain level. Okay? So, what are the conditions? You see, this goes absolutely to the root. What are the conditions that form the basis of all of our activity, productive activity, not just today. Okay? This is a very important point. Not just today in contemporary times, since historical times, over the years, over the centuries, how has mankind arranged, okay, arranged his labor, arranged the production of all the material things that we use, for instance. And what is there a law? Okay? The best part of this, this aspect is that we are close to, to the very law of development of these conditions. Okay? I said you have laws in physics, you have laws in chemistry. Okay? So, is it possible? Marxism comes very close, and die-hard adherents of Marxism would say that Karl Marx gave us a law of development of these conditions. Now, this is a phenomenal thing. If particularly when you consider that compared to the physical sciences, compared to the hard sciences, as far as human beings, human behavior, etc. are concerned, you may have principles, you may have theories, but a law, it's very difficult to have a law like corresponding maybe to the law of gravitation and the laws of motion, okay, given to us in physics. Okay, so this is one question: how are societies organized and structured, and how do societies develop and change? So, I have used the word, the term historical materialism here. I will talk about it a while later. Basically, Marxism tries to show us the structure, okay, of societies, and 2, how these structures change. Okay. Before we move on, we have to place Karl Marx in the whole historical scheme of things. Okay. When he began to develop his theory of historical materialism, okay, what was the existing scenario then? Okay, or you could say rather, what was the philosophy, the kind of philosophy that was prevalent then. Okay? The philosophy that was prevalent then was idealism. Right? Marx found himself in a situation where people followed a great philosopher named Hegel, right? Named Hegel. Now, idealism says that all our actions are the result of abstract ideas. Okay? This is opposite what Marx would say later on. This is the reverse of what Marx would say. Idealism holds that these ideas are independent of the material world. Okay? They are not related to matter, that ideas exist beforehand, and there is what Hegel calls an absolute spirit that guides the universe, guides our actions, etc. So, ideas are primary and matter is secondary. And this world that we live in, idealism holds, is simply a reflection of this idea or a set of ideas, a group of ideas. Okay? Our world is a reflection of this idea. So, what does idealism do? Idealism holds that ideas are supreme. Okay? On the other hand, Marx would say no, it is matter, okay? It is our material lives that direct everything, direct our actions, our thoughts, our beliefs, and we shall see how. Marx was a member of a group. He was a young Hegelian, in the sense that he, this is a seeming paradox. Marx would go on to revise Hegel, but he began as a young Hegelian. This was a group of scholars. Okay? They formed a group, or like you form clubs, for instance. They formed a group known as the young Hegelians. Now, which would mean that Marx agreed with what Hegel had to say, but no, like many people who many geniuses, he revised. Okay? He revised the theory of Hegel. Now, Hegel forwarded you could say a mega theory of how things work, right? And this is called the theory of dialectics. Now, I will just read it and explain it immediately. Dialectics is the science of the general laws of motion and development of nature, human society and thought. This is you can see the enormity of this, the science of laws of motion and development, particularly of for our case here, for this course here, human society. How does human society move? How does human society develop? Now, the theory of dialectics, okay, it deals not only with facts, but with facts in their connection. It tries to show the connection between or among facts. That is the processes. Okay? Not only with isolated ideas, but it seeks to give us laws, not only with the particular, but with the general. So, connections and generalizations, these are the two important aspects of dialectics. Okay, now look at this more fleshed out definition. A development that seemingly repeats, now this word is important, seemingly repeats the stages already. This essentially is dialectics. Okay? A development, dialectics, as we know, is a development. It seeks to find the development in motion, accounting for motion and change. So, a development that seemingly repeats the stages already past, but it repeats them differently on a higher basis. This is important. History repeats itself, all right, but it repeats itself somehow, like the DNA spiral, for instance. The DNA spiral, you see, is repeating itself, but there are different stages. This is a higher level than this level. This is a higher level than this level. Okay? So, I am reading it again. A development that seemingly repeats the stages already past, but repeats them differently on a higher basis. A development, so to speak, this is the word, in spirals. Remember, we talked about the DNA spiral. In spirals, not in a straight line. And what is this development characterized by? This development is characterized by leaps, catastrophes, revolution, breaks in continuity. That is the movement from one structure to another structure. Social movement is in the form of leaps, catastrophes and revolutions. So things move in dialectics from stage 1, say this is stage 1, right? It moves from stage 1, which he calls a thesis. A thesis here is it is not the thesis that we submit for a degree. A thesis here is a certain stage or a certain condition of being. Okay, so society as is at the moment in say stage 1, right? Slowly it moves to its opposite, to its antithesis, okay, and which is stage 2, and finally it reaches a stage of synthesis. The importance of synthesis is that the thesis leading to the antithesis and the antithesis leading to the thesis, the synthesis is essentially a mixture of the thesis and the antithesis. Okay. One example given, it's the thesis and the antithesis together. So the synthesis that is the stage after the antithesis is a mixture of the thesis and antithesis, in that elements of both the thesis and the antithesis are to be found in the synthesis, but in a newer form. Okay. The thesis is not repeated completely in the synthesis, nor is the antithesis repeated completely in the synthesis. Okay. Parts of the thesis and the antithesis, okay, give rise to the synthesis, and this is how dialectical movement happens. So this synthesis that we have here is then what? It is a new thesis, right? Like there was a synthesis before this, this, and which is the new thesis for the next movement, right? So I am quoting from Hegel here. Hegel said, "What experience and history teach is this, that nations and governments have never learned anything from history or acted upon any lessons they might have drawn from it." So here is Hegel telling us that history will repeat itself. Okay? History will repeat itself in a spiral as thesis, antithesis and synthesis, okay, that will repeat themselves at a higher level. And having known this, what stops us from drawing lessons from history? You may have heard of the famous proverb that those who deny history or those who ignore history are doomed to repeat it. So Hegel says that what experience and history teach is that nations and governments repeat the same sort of mistakes, and they have never learned anything from history nor drawn any lessons from it. Well, this is what, look at this slide, this is what Friedrich Engels had to say about Hegel's theory of idealism and dialectical idealism. He says Hegel's understanding was a colossal miscarriage. It was a colossal miscarriage in the sense that it had the promise, like a fetus has a promise, has the promise of being born and growing up into a full-fledged human being. Okay? This theory was a huge miscarriage in the sense, and we shall see why. Okay? Marx and Engels adopted the dialectical part of Hegel's theory, but denounced completely the idealist part. So if Hegel gave them dialectical idealism, they removed idealism, they kept the dialectics part of it, and now they are going to replace the idealist school with something else. Okay? Remember, what did idealism tell us? Idealism says that the entire universe emanates from idea or absolute spirit, right, and that idea determines everything, ideas determine everything. Marx and Engels said no, and this is a quotation from Marx: men's ideas are the most direct emanations of their material state. See how they completely reverse this. In idealism, we saw that ideas lead to our material lives. Okay? Here we see our ideas come from matter. So, material state gives rise to ideas and not vice versa, as was claimed by Hegel. Okay? So, in this school of thought of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels called dialectical materialism, see, idealism has been removed and it has been replaced by this word materialism. So, in this dialectical materialist school, nature or matter is primary. Ideas are secondary, if not being there at all, okay, in the sense of the original idea. So, nature or matter is primary in the whole scheme of things as understood by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Therefore, our thoughts and ideas are the reflection of the material world. So, what do we have here? We have Hegelian dialectics plus materialism equals dialectical materialism. Okay? So, Hegelian dialectics, and out goes the idealist school, and in comes the materialist school, and this is called dialectical materialism. Okay. Now, if you look at this slide, you will see in the first case, this is our consciousness is our consciousness, that is the idealist school, our consciousness determines matter, and the materialist school, matter determines our consciousness. Okay. Now, we said that Marxism looks at the structure of society and accounts for the changes in or the movement of society, okay, in the historical process. Now, the question is, what leads to a change in social arrangements? And these have to be looked at, not small social arrangements, but what leads to what he calls the leaps, the catastrophes and revolutions. Okay. Now, we have come here to a very important slide, a very important point, and I need you to look at this carefully. Marx says that there are two things. Okay. There are forces of production and there are relations of production. Now, forces of production are things like technology, for instance, they are the driving force of any production process. Now, what production are we talking about here? We are talking about the production of our material lives, okay, in which you and I, all of us are involved as laborers. Okay. We give our labor and we produce the various aspects of our material lives, okay, and these are driven by many things including technology. Now, in these forces of production, because of these forces of production, because of the arrangements, we have something called the relations of production. Okay. Let me give you an example. Let us say the feudal times, the times of feudalism. Land was the most important factor in the production process and not the factory. The factory comes in with the industrial revolution, okay, largely speaking. In the feudal system, land was the biggest force of production. Okay. Now, related to that, we should then have relations of production. Okay. Without us working, without human beings working, there can't be any production. Who produces? You and I, all human beings who are involved in the process of work. We all contribute to society with our labor. But the relations of production, will vary with the forces of production. The sense that, coming back to the feudal system, in feudalism what happens is the relations of production are between basically two sets of people. One is the landowner and the other is the person who tills the land, whom we call the tenant or the serf or the vassal. Okay. So, there is a particular kind of social organization. The relations of production are nothing but the social organization, and the social organization is between between the owners of production and the people who are working in that production process, right. So, socio-cultural, coming back to the theory, socio-cultural change happens. Now, this is the most important part at this stage of our understanding Marxism. Okay, please look at this slide. Socio-cultural change will happen. When these two things come in conflict. When the forces of production and the relations of production come into conflict. Usually in a stable society, the forces of production, which has the set of the relations of production, okay, are not in conflict. But a time comes, since there is motion, society has to move forward. A time comes when the relations of production and the forces of production do not match, and that is when Karl Marx says, that is when a crisis happens, or that is when it is time for a change. Okay. Now, how does this happen? Now, the forces of production are something that are things that are very dynamic. For instance, the forces of production involve innovation, okay, involve new techniques, right. So, the forces of production reach such a stage that the existing relations of production, okay, they do not or they cannot match the forces of production that drive the production process, right. And as Karl Marx says, the relations of production act as fetters. They act as fetters or chains on the forces of production, and that is when the conflict happens. And socio-cultural change, okay, happens whenever this conflict comes about. Now, the forces of production are therefore land, raw materials, tools, machines, knowledge, and also people, that is the labor of people. All these things these are forces that drive any production process. Okay. Now, I will quickly move into what is Marx's concept of man or conception of man. Okay. We need to first understand, any philosopher for that matter will have an understanding of what man is. What is it? What is a human being? There is a definition. He or she has a certain understanding. Okay. Some may say man is simply something made of the earth, or clay, for instance, was a metaphor used at some time. Man, many would say, is a machine. Man, some people, would say man is a divine being made in the image of God, etc. Okay. So, what was Karl Marx's conception of man? And I am reading here, man is directly a natural being. So, the first thing, man is a natural being, man is an organic being, man is part of nature. Okay. As a natural being and as a living natural being, he is on the one hand endowed with natural vital powers. Man has certain powers, certain vital powers, okay, certain abilities. Okay, and he is an active natural being. Man can act, man can produce, man can create. These forces exist in him, and as I said, tendencies and abilities and as instincts. So, first, man is what? Man is a natural being, and he is endowed, he is gifted, so to speak, with vital powers, okay, which enable him to be an active person, a creative person, creative not in the sense of simply writing poetry or doing art or music, creative in the sense of being able to change things that are in front of him, that is to change nature. So, these forces exist in him as tendencies and abilities, and they are also his instincts. But Marx says, on the other hand, as a natural, corporeal, sensuous, objective being, he is also number 2. Man is also a suffering being. Okay? So, A, man is a natural being. B, he is a suffering being. He is a suffering, conditioned and limited creature like animals and plants. Of course, all of us are limited. The very fact that we are born and we can't stop the process of aging, we can't stop the process, we all of us die. Okay? We are limited creatures, and in that we are similar to animals and plants. A being which does not have its nature outside itself is not a natural being and plays no part in the system of nature. A being which has no object outside itself is not an objective being. Okay? Suffice it for us here to simply realize this, that man is a natural being and a suffering being. Why suffering? Because he is limited. Okay? Because we human beings are limited beings. Third, Marx also says that it is what distinguishes us from nature. Okay? What eventually separates us from nature is the fact that we labor. Okay? We do work. And we will come to that later on. I will now give you two very, very seminal, very oft quoted, very oft referred to brief passages, because they are here the crux of what I am trying to say about Marxism. Okay? Let's look at the first one. Marx says, in the social production which men carry on, now here men of course stands for both men and women, in the social production which men carry on, they enter into definite relations. We, in our social production, in the production of our social lives, we enter into definite relations. Now, these relations are indispensable, we cannot do without them, and independent of their will. Okay? So, in the social production, we will enter into different relations. Okay? For instance, relations of who owns the business in which you are working as an employee, who is your employer, for instance. We enter into definite relations of social production. There are also other kinds of relations here that are indispensable. As if you are social beings, if you live in groups, we have to enter into different kinds of relations. These are indispensable and independent of their will, in the sense that will here could also mean independent of their desires, whether you like it or not. Okay? Whether you like it or you do not like it, you are in the social production process, and you are in a definite relation with the whole system. Now, these relations of production correspond to a definite stage of development of their material powers of production. Okay? Which is the relations of production that you and I, all of us are in, does not come from a vacuum. It is not that it is just there. There are reasons for it being there. Okay? These relations of production will correspond to a certain stage of development of the material powers of production. So, matter here is the cause and not ideas. Okay? Matter is the cause, and it gives rise to, it will determine, so to speak, your relation of production and where you stand in the production process. Next, the sum total of these relations of production constitutes the economic structure of society. Okay? That is, the total of the relations of production that you and I are in, taken in its totality, what it does is that it creates, or rather it is the economic structure of society, and it is the real foundation which they call the base. Okay? The forces of production and the relations of production, okay, and the sum total of these give rise to a certain base, or here we call a certain foundation, on which rise legal and political superstructures, and to which correspond definite forms of social consciousness. Look at this very, very carefully. First, we should have a base from which, where do our ideas come from? Where does our consciousness, social consciousness come from? Where do our categories, cultural patterns come from? Okay. Do they descend from the heavens? No. Marx says that they do not descend from heavens, from the heavens, they do not descend from any ideas, eternal ideas that are there, they come from beneath. They, so these production processes, the forces and relations of production, they form the economic base on which there will be corresponding legal and political superstructure. So, the other word here is the superstructure. Okay. So, whoever, this is very important, whoever has power in the base will organize the relations of production according to their convenience. Okay. And the legal and political things that rise, which are the superstructures on the base, okay, will serve the interests of those who control the base. You follow? So, whenever we talk about morality, whenever we talk about rules and regulations of society, when we talk about legal issues, okay, these are, Marx held that these lead to our social consciousness. Okay. Ultimately, it can be boiled down, so to speak, to the economic base. So, what is the most important word here? That economics. Economics determines everything. Okay. And economics to do with what? Economics to do with matter, to the material things and the arrangement of our material lives, the arrangement of our labor, etc. Okay. So, I want you to spend some time on this slide. I want you to read it over and over again, so that you can internalize, okay, it soaks into you and you understand the enormity of the profundity of what he is saying. Now, here is another quotation from Marx, and he says that, well, the world, these social arrangements, etc., these are so stark, right, and the hapless person in this whole system, what does he or she do? How does he or she cope? He says religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of soulless conditions. Okay? It is the opium of the people. Now, many people are startled when they see, see the metaphor used. Religion is like opium. The point Marx is using, he says in the first place, for the oppressed, it is the heart of a heartless world. It's the oppressed person's sigh. It's his soul. Okay, but it is also the opium of the people, in the sense that religion creates you could say religion creates a world, a hallucinatory world. If we follow the metaphor of opium, religion creates a hallucinatory world in which the oppressed feel that the situation in which I am in this world would be rectified, okay, rectified in another world. For instance, if the religious person believes in an afterlife, that there is life after death, and that one goes to either hell or heaven, or for that matter one goes on to another form of life, or another, enters the body of another person, gets a new birth, for instance. Okay, Marx says that these are helpful for them, no doubt. Okay, they may be the soul of such soulless conditions. Nevertheless, these are not real. These are hallucinations that are there for us, and these are like, so to speak, psychological crutches. Now, you remember Richard Dawkins here, okay, and you remember what Dawkins said, that said about the God meme, for instance. Okay, so it's a similar kind of thing said here. Okay, so well, you'll recall that in the 2 or 3 lectures before this lecture, what I did was I took up certain texts, right. In this case, we are not taking up any text as such. Well, as you know, Marx's famous work Das Kapital in 3 volumes. These are huge texts which we cannot, at least the Capital, we cannot use them as text for this lecture. So, what I have done here is, instead of a text, I have taken quotations, okay, from Karl Marx, mostly, maybe a couple of them from Friedrich Engels. Now, with the quotations, and I have picked out those which I thought could make good enough representation of their ideas in order to explain Marxism as a cultural theory. Okay. So, this is the methodology for this particular lecture. Now, I am reading from Marx. Men, or as human beings, men make their own history, but they do not make it just as they please. Okay. Now, this is this whole question of whether we have complete free will or everything is determined. Marx says, yes, there is no doubt we make our own history, but the conditions under circumstances under which we make our history are not something that we choose. Okay. So, men make their own history, but they do not make it just as they please. They do not make it under circumstances chosen by themselves, but under, and this is very important, under circumstances directly found, given and transmitted from what? From the past. Okay. The past is has always determined the kind of lives that we lead. Remember, even Hegel had said that, well, why are we not following the lessons of history? Why are we not rather drawing lessons from history? Okay. Marx says here that we all make our own history, all right, but the past is always there. The past is what determines the circumstances of our making history is given by the past. And then the tradition of all the dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the brain of the living. So, there is no doing away with the past, which means that all these social systems that, remember the thesis, the synthesis and the antithesis. Okay. So, it moves in this spiral, and each stage contains something, is a synthesis of this former thesis and antithesis stages. Okay. So, this is a quotation which I thought was important to bring to you in a bid to show you the historical materialist approach. Therefore, Marx says history repeats itself, first as tragedy, second as farce. Okay. History repeats, all right, and when it repeats itself for the first time, well, you can say, oh, it's repeated itself, it's tragic, because tragic, why? Because the same mistakes are being made, the same pattern is followed. But he says the second time when it happens, then we have to regard it not as tragic, but something comical. Okay, because the pattern instantiates itself and we have not drawn lessons from history. So, yes, this is really one of my favorites. Let us read this first. The mode of production in material life determines the general character of the social, political and intellectual processes of life. If you go by this, really this is the key, so to speak, with which you open the door to understanding the kind of life that you and I lead. The mode of production. Now, first let us break it up. The mode of, what is a mode of production? The mode of production, we could say, is a way of production. Okay? A mode of production is a way of production, the way of producing our material lives. For instance, ancient slavery is a mode of production, feudalism is a mode of production. Every mode of production will have its own forces of production, and recall what is its corresponding term? Relations of production. Human beings will be in certain social, economic relations and relationships among themselves, and that will follow the way of production. So, for instance, if you find yourself, you go back in time and you find yourself in a feudal setup, then you are very generally speaking, your way of life, your intellectual processes, your consciousness, everything for that matter will be determined by that feudal way of life or feudal mode of production. Okay. So, again here again we find that here is a reinstantiation of the same thing, that production, material life and the arrangements of production form the base. Okay, you recall it, form the base, and from the base it gives what arises are certain legal and political superstructures, which again give are important for our or for our social consciousness. So, our social consciousness depends on the mode of production. Well, so far we have looked only at part of what I wish to bring to you. The next lecture, which is lecture 9, will be devoted to the other points and issues that I want to raise when we talk about Marxism as a cultural theory. For now, what we need to remember are 3 things. 1, the difference between dialectical idealism and dialectical materialism. 2, Marx's conception of man. Okay. 3, how society changes, that is dialectics, and particularly the forces of production and the relations of production. Well, we move on to the discussion, and well, let us see what the first question is. The first question is, well, if I asked you what is idealism, how would you define idealism? Remember, who was the proponent of idealism? Hegel. Okay? And the answer is, idealism sees history as a history of thought, and it holds that our actions are the result of certain abstract ideas. Hegel even goes on to say there is something called an absolute spirit, okay, which determines our actions. So, the ideas that we have are in no way related to the material world. Why? Because our ideas come from those original ideas. Okay? Ideas are not independent of the material, are independent of the material world as far as idealism is concerned, and the very world that you and I inhabit is nothing but a reflection of this idea, okay, or set of ideas. We are in, and so what would be the conception of man here? The conception of man according to Hegel is nothing but simply man is a reflection of an original idea. Okay, question number 2. What is the difference between the idealist and the materialist approaches to consciousness? The answer is, in the idealist school, okay, it is held that consciousness gives rise to matter, and in the materialist school, in which matter is paramount, matter or our material lives give rise to consciousness. How, according to Marxism, does socio-cultural change take place? According to Marxism, socio-cultural changes take place when 2 things come into conflict. Okay? These 2 things are very seminal to any understanding of Marxist theory. There is no Marxist theory without these 2 ideas of the forces of production and the relations of production. So, what are the forces of production? Land, people, our labor, technology, for instance. All these things are the driving forces of production, and the relations of production are the social relations, okay, that we occupy because of the forces of production. Now, a time comes, because life is dynamic, history is dynamic, okay, we move on in time, we are active agents, we are creative beings, and we innovate, we improvise, okay, there is the growth of knowledge, right. So, obviously, at some point of time, the forces of production are so strong that, and they evolve so quickly that the relations of they sort of they sort of outgrow the relations of production. And if you remember, I had said Marx uses the metaphor of fetters or chains. The relations of production they act as if they chain the forces of production, but the forces of production obviously will try to break free of the relations of production. Okay? And this gives rise to a crisis which leads to a major change in our social systems. Next, what according to Marx characterizes social production? And this is the answer from Marx. In the social production which men carry on, they enter into what? Definite relations that are indispensable. You have to work. After all, we are A, natural beings, B, we are suffering beings, we are limited, but we are 3, also laboring beings. Okay? We try to change nature and our situation, okay, by being active laboring beings. So, in the social production which men carry on, we enter into certain relations which we cannot do without, but which are independent of our will, whether I desire it or not. I occupy a certain state in the relations of production, okay, and they are independent of their will or desire. And these relations of production will correspond to a definite stage of development of the material powers of production. What was our question? What according to Marx characterizes social production? Okay. Social production is therefore characterized by certain relations, certain definite relations. And what is the nature of these relations? These relations of production will correspond to a certain stage of the material powers of production, okay, a stage higher, a stage lower, for instance, okay, and they will correspond, will get their nature from them, right. So, I hope this is a very difficult task for me, and as you know, there are so many ways in which you can talk about Marx, about Marxist cultural theory. Today I have done really only a minuscule part. There are so many things to talk about, and I am wondering how to really make them into 2 compact lectures. The next lecture will also be on Marxism, some of the things that I had left out, and I will also be talking about communism, in the sense that what Marx sought. Marx believed, and I would like to end today's lecture with this. Marx says that so far philosophers and thinkers and intellectuals, what have they been doing? They have simply interpreted the world. Okay? They have given their own interpretations of what the world is. They have their own theories. But he says the point is not to stop at that. The point, he says, but the point is to change it. Okay? So, you have a theory, and here the political practice comes, political aspect of theory. Remember, we talked about cultural theory, theorizing as not just an airy-fairy intellectual abstract activity. Theory is a political practice, and nowhere else perhaps will you find this coming in of theory and practice, of praxis so strongly, but in the person of Karl Marx. Okay? Thank you so much.